Okay, our next speaker is Ben Thomas. Ben is the Senior Policy Director for Agriculture at the Environmental Defense Fund. He focuses on creating innovative and pragmatic solutions to address environmental risks from and to agriculture by working with key farm groups and policymakers across state and federal government. Most recently, Ben served as the Director of the Montana Department of Agriculture. In that role, he oversaw economic and regulatory programs serving Montana's #1 industry. In 2020, he led the rapid creation and development of 2 new programs created to address faults in the agriculture markets created by COVID-19 pandemic. He previously served in several roles in federal government at the USDA and the U.S. Senate. Ben was raised on Diversified Family Farm near Morton in the Texas Panhandle. Please welcome Ben Thomas.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I've appreciated the conversation so far. Something that really resonated for me from the last conversation was the phrase, public benefits of private lands. I spent the last 4 years in Montana. Obviously, we're very focused on Montana lands there because that's like 64% of the state. Texas is very different, and what I'm talking about today is actually how to maximize those public benefits by compensating producers for the benefits that they can achieve on their farm, but that reach beyond the border. So he gave my introduction. The Environmental Defense Fund is a nonprofit environmental NGO based in the US, but we work in a number of countries, 20 or 30, but our ag work is really primarily focused in the US, India, China, and the EU. We're also, in a sense, local. I'm in our Texas office where we have the Texas water team, and I know many of you may have worked with them in the past. A bit of my personal background, I was raised on a cotton and peanut farm near Whiteface, Texas, so straight west of Lubbock in Cochran County. And I've spent most of my career in DC and Montana. This is literally the first time I've had the opportunity to come back to the Panhandle for work, and I really appreciate it. And I knew as soon as I stepped off the plane and the wind blasted me in the face, I knew I was coming home. If you'd asked me when I left the farm to go to law school, you think you'll ever come back to Texas and speak at a water conference about climate change, I would have said, no, thank you. Someone else can do that, but here I am. Certainly, when I told my dad what I was up to, he's at the farm right now. He got in his pickup and drove straight east. Asked him where he was going. He was just sure he had somewhere else to be. I'm just kidding. He's very proud of me. Although I didn't find my path in life staying on the farm, it's those same rural values that have really driven my entire career working in ag policy. And I certainly have some understanding of the challenges you're facing today and how they'll become greater over time. And I didn't come with any answers for you. I did deal with some water issues in Montana, but it's a very different landscape, and frankly, water is not my expertise. Instead, I'm here talking about carbon markets. You may be asking yourself, why is this guy here talking about carbon markets? I'm up here asking myself, why am I here talking about carbon markets? Brittany, Aspen, does anyone know? I'm just kidding. It's an important conversation because this is all happening right now. It's happening to you right now. So I think it's important to be aware of the opportunities, the risks, to take part in that conversation, to give your perspectives. And it's a very dense conversation. I might lose you. Hang on. I think you'll come back. Maybe not. Maybe I'll collectively put us all back in understanding these issues and trying to translate them, or I'll get run off the stage anyway. So we'll just see how this goes. I'm as curious as you are. So carbon markets. I expect we're all coming with a different understanding of the issues, a different awareness. Some of you probably know much more than I do. Some of you may even be engaged in the markets right now. But I think it's worthwhile for us to level set because it's very confusing, and interest in carbon markets is just going to grow as we move forward. I look at the action the U.S. Senate took a few months ago. They passed the Growing Climate Solutions today, which attempts to address some of the biggest problems facing these markets today. That vote was 97 in favor to 1. 2 didn't vote. 97 senators agreed on something. That is unheard of today, unprecedented, but it just demonstrates the level of bipartisan interest in this space. And I do hope that bill does become law. There's some challenges in the House side, but I think that continued bipartisan support here will be a very good indicator as we head into 2023 Farm Bill negotiations. Now, EDF has been working in this space for years, and we're still even struggling to agree internally where we think the guardrails should be. And I'll generally state it as this: we want guardrails in place to produce the highest quality credits without being so onerous that discourages involvement. And we want those two things, high quality and high engagement, because that's how to maximize the mitigation potential of this tool. I also approach this from the producer perspective. No one understands the risks here greater than farmers. They face it every year. And no one understands the limits of what can be done better than those in ag as well, because they often take on the risk and the very high cost of some of these activities, and they deal with environmental problems every year as part of their job. But too often, all of that risk or too much of the cost is placed on producers, while the benefits reach beyond their property line. So I think it's fair to have a bit of skepticism on all sides, because again, if too much of that risk is placed in one place or the other, this is not going to work out and we'll have missed an opportunity for climate mitigation. So let me go back at the beginning. Now I'm starting the conversation. What is a carbon market? I'll gloss over the science a bit, not because it's important. It is, it's critically important, but it's also divisive and dense, and I'm no scientist, but it is kind of the basis of all this working, so I think it's important to very quickly address. We are experiencing the impact of climate change today, which is a gradual increase in global temperature and more variable regional expressions of that shift, which may be drought, flooding, combination of both. This increases risks to agriculture. The cause of temperature increases is the rising presence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we're talking about primarily carbon, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and a few others. And those are emitted from both natural and human activity, and persist in the atmosphere for very long periods of time, during which they may trap heat, warm the climate, and there you have it. Much more complicated than that, but that is the premise. You may not agree, but that is the underlying idea of carbon markets. One moment. The result of these changing conditions is overall increased economic costs and human impacts. How that looks at a local level, it may be vastly different. There may even be some opportunities. It may create the opportunity to grow new crops entirely. It may change the entire ag landscape of some regions over time. And the idea of but overall, on the whole, it is negative and there will be consequences. The idea of a carbon market is this: if we can somehow assign or discover a price for atmospheric carbon, then maybe we can create a business case for removing it, or to find solutions other than emitting it in the first place, which is often much cheaper to do. I was very deliberate in saying price and not cost here. Carbon price, not carbon cost. I know there have been conversations on carbon tax. That's a cost. That's an increase in the cost of emitting. What we're talking about here is about assigning a price. So in other words, a reason to get paid to do something. And that's especially relevant in the ag space. What does it mean for farmers? Well, there's the potential for a big opportunity here. Farms have vastly different emission profiles based on type and region and practices, but this broad model suggests an opportunity in receiving compensation from the private sector for implementing good practices when it comes to fertilizer application or manure management, and there might be an opportunity in drawing down carbon from the atmosphere and into ag lands, in other words, carbon sequestration. I do want to touch base very, very quickly, and I'm being cognizant of the time. I won't get you back on time, but I'll be shorter than 30 minutes. Compliance versus regulatory, very quickly, what's the difference? Compliance market is typically when the government steps in, and that may or may not involve carbon credits at all. It basically says, let's take a snapshot of emissions, require reductions, have some sort of enforcement mechanism, and carbon credits may be a way to offset those industries that can't reduce enough on their own. But in the US right now, in this space, we're talking about voluntary markets. That means it happens without government involvement. And in fact, it's happening today, right now. And it's essentially because companies have noticed a consumer interest in climate and companies that are taking action. That led to claims of net zero, net negative, and then expectations that they were in fact true and not just marketing. And so that created the kind of conditions for a market on the voluntary side so that companies could show they were being climate friendly. In the absence of a government, other folks stepped in the private sector to kind of determine who gets paid for what the conditions are for that market. And that's where kind of the issue arises, or many of the issues. For a producer who may be out there having these conversations, they see these different protocols and may not have a way to align them. They work very different, and it's hard to say where they all fit and which give them the best opportunity, either in terms of finances or in terms of how much effort it takes to generate those credits. And I hope there is some of that alignment. That is one of the goals of the Growing Climate Solutions Act, but there's probably more that could happen. I also want to recognize that the folks creating these protocols, I see them as true innovators. They're kind of on the cutting edge and for the most part focused on opportunities for producers. Not always the case though. That's all very dense, but in some of the time I have left, I want to highlight a few specific issues that I think may be more relatable. They may not be, I don't know. First, because this conversation started years ago in the compliance market context, the ag industry was unsurprisingly not interested because it could have increased their costs and made it harder for them to operate. So they weren't at the table when the standards were developed, and that is not a good thing because some of these standards, I think, are very difficult to fit into an ag context, and I'll demonstrate that with two of those standards. The first is the concept of permanence. It is what it sounds like, permanent. Carbon exists for very long periods of time in the atmosphere. So for sequestration to make sense, it must also be sequestered for long periods of time. May say 100 years, 50 years, ideally it would be permanent much longer than that. This may work in the ag space if we're talking about land repurposing or conservation easements, but those come with social costs to rural communities, and we need to be fully aware of those. When we're talking about working lands, also on that note, if we weigh too heavily on removing acres from food production, eventually our efforts here will collide with demand needs that come from a rising population. That's not going to get us to where we need to be. Most of the sequestration activities on working lands are practices like no-till, reduced tillage, cover crops, and those can be very effective and sometimes make business sense. But carbon sequestration in these systems can be very quickly overturned by returning to normal tillage practices. So if we want to capture climate mitigation potential, we need to find some flexibility on permanence because it doesn't work the same way in agriculture. I think there are solutions to that, but they're not yet broadly accepted. I'm so sorry. It's drier here than it is elsewhere. Y'all know that? Man. Understatement. But there is an opportunity on permanence when it comes to avoided emissions. Unlike sequestration, avoided emissions are by their nature permanent and non-reversible. So this is an opportunity. It may create a chance, for example, using credits to finance biodigesters or some other activities. The second standard is that reductions must be additional to qualify. And that's to say they must be additional to what would have occurred but for the presence of the carbon market. Doesn't make sense to me. Kind of does, but when I try to apply it to any industry, I get confused, but especially to agriculture. We have a few proven ag conservation programs like EQIP and CSP and CRP, which help on the conservation front, but may not totally compensate the producer for the cost of implementing that practice or technology. I think credits should be an opportunity to round out that compensation and to encourage more broad adoption of those things. And we're just right now kind of locked out of that due to this issue of additionality. The second big picture I want to leave you with outside of those two standards that are really just to demonstrate some of the obstacles we face. Generally, and this is not the case for everyone, but folks who are excited about the potential here are often entirely or too much focused on sequestering soil in working lands. But we need to be fully cognizant of the potential here. Our research shows that we can sequester something like 4 to 6% of US emissions in ag land. First of all, that may not sound like a lot, but it is. That's a lot of emissions, and the reality is we're not going to get the whole pie anywhere. We're going to need to get a piece of it where we can. But how that opportunity is allocated and measuring the reductions over time presents real challenges. We still have much to learn about what practices produce what results and how long those results last, and whether or not they may eventually mount to pressures on productivity that will cause reversal. We don't really even have the infrastructure to measure and report on all this, which almost any market will require. And that may lead to very different conclusions at the end on which practices really get us to where we need to be. And that's all true. I'm not suggesting we turn completely away, but we need to diversify beyond just soil carbon and consider all mitigation opportunities, especially when those opportunities may be less risky and produce more results, like reducing methane emissions or optimizing fertilizer inputs. By considering the broader opportunities, we can have a greater impact with less risk of reversal and also maximize the economic opportunity to landowners in the development of ag carbon markets. Third thing let's see how I do on time. I'm kind of okay. This is all very innovative and great potential, but there are so many obstacles and there are risks in this conversation to agriculture and to farms that we cannot be blind to. So regardless of how this conversation goes, we need to diversify all of our options. There are federal programs, I mentioned earlier, CRP, EQIP, CSP, they're not perfect, but they also result in huge greenhouse gas benefits, while also meeting other very important goals that we care about: water quality, quantity, wildlife. These are all things the public cares about. Heading into the Farm Bill in the middle of this conversation, some of my top priorities to ensure that these programs are recognized for delivering real results, that these programs are improved where needed and fully resourced to meet the ambitions of farmers across the country. Right now, that's currently not the case, and I certainly wouldn't want what's happening on the carbon market side to detract from the importance of these programs. At EDF, we're also doing some great work on ag finance to show that, hey, there are some resilience benefits from climate-smart agriculture. It may reduce risk. If that's the case, then maybe there should be preferential financing options for those folks. It's not going to work for everyone, but again, we need every tool in the toolbox. When I say that, I was kind of thinking of a story to tell, and when on the farm, when we had a pivot stopped or a tractor broke down, my dad never showed up with a screwdriver or something. That'd be absurd. He showed up with his whole toolbox, which is the size of my car, and had every tool imaginable. But then I realized, like almost every time, he didn't have that one thing he needed. It never made sense to me. but I figure that's how his pickup got to be so big. Not really sure. Back to the public programs. Another benefit over carbon markets is that they give us much more flexibility to continue research or improve our knowledge base by advancing innovation and potentially developing new solutions without some of the current limits on markets, some of which I addressed today, and there are many others. I see an opportunity in relying on these public programs to create conditions for markets to really flourish as they develop. Certainly those things can happen in tandem as well. And lastly, I took this towards the end, but it comes to my mind frequently, the balance of risk is part of each of these conversations. With application of USDA programs, it's generally not an issue because we're making payments for broad benefits, many benefits, not usually just one. So it may be water quality, soil quality, wildlife, et cetera. And so if we don't reach targets on any of those, we don't come back and ask for the money back. We learn from that and we target our investments better. That's not the case with markets because these are private contracts. What happens if you make contract commitments on sequestering carbon and 10 years later they measure that and find out it was less than expected? What happens to you as a producer who received the payment? It's up to the people developing these markets to figure out, and also up to the farmer to think very, very clearly about that risk allocation in making a decision. I'll just go through to the conclusion a little bit. If there's time for one or two questions, that would be great. If not, we're behind anyway. So I wanted to bring this home a little bit. I've worked in ag my entire career in some way, from hoeing cotton fields as a kid to running a sand fire day after day as a young adult. Then in DC, public policy, Montana policy. I never dreamed I'd work for an environmental NGO. Never did dream. And most of them I still wouldn't. But Montana, I saw such extreme conditions year after year that I finally decided that yes, we need disaster assistance, we need all kinds of support, but we also need to get better at getting ahead of the problem. I've been saying for a while the two greatest risks facing agriculture today is climate change and poorly designed climate change policy that just makes everything worse. But we're in an unprecedented time, not just in terms of the challenges, but in terms of the willingness to talk and work together, because we need the right stakeholders at the table. Some of these groups are still pushing ideas that are so divisive they don't stand a chance, or they're so short-sighted that they'll simply push our emissions elsewhere, increase food prices, and hurt farmers. That's why EDF is so committed to building coalitions. That's why we started the Food and Ag Climate Alliance with Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, and the ag cooperatives. Because it's only by working together that we're going to come up with solutions that actually work for everyone. And that dialogue is important. It's important to continue it because failing to engage here could result in policies or markets that were developed with ignorance of their impact on rural communities or on farms, and that will be worse than getting us nowhere. It will be setting us back. So thanks for having me. I know that was very dense, but hopefully you learned something, or at least, got to enjoy a little bit more food. So thanks.